Trying out some different eyes this morning, so I don't know how they're going to work out. Pardon? Yeah. I'm supposed to have reading on the bottom of these, so you may have to bear with me if I can't read it. The read that we had by Jacob was Matthew is one of the three accounts of Jesus calming the waters. The one that we're going to be looking at primarily is Mark's account, but Luke also records it in Luke chapter 8, verses 22 to 25. Now it came to pass on a certain day that he went into a ship with his disciples, and he said unto them, Let us go over unto the other side of the lake. And they launched forth. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And there came down a storm of wind on the lake. And they were filled with water and were in jeopardy. They came to him and awake him, saying, Master, Master, we perish. And he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging of the waters, and they ceased, and there was a calm. And he said unto them, Where is your faith? And they, being afraid, wondered, saying one to another, What manner of man is this? He that commandeth even the winds and the water, and they obey him. And then back in Mark chapter 8, beginning at verse 18. I'm reading the wrong one. Mark chapter 4, beginning at verse 35. At 35. And the same day, when the even was come, he saith unto them, Let us pass over unto the other side. When they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship. There were also with him other little ships. And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat upon the ship, so that it was now full. And he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they awake him and say unto him, Master, carest not that we perish? And he arose and rebuked the wind, and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said unto them, Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly, and said one to another, What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? I'm going to take this Mark's account verse by verse. It was the same day. But tracing back through Mark's record, it would appear this means the day was found in chapter 3, verse 20. Time which commenced without time from the even to eat a meal. And it was now even. And he said unto them, Let us pass over to the other side. It appears that the suggestion was made because of physical exhaustion. so that he might get away from the pressures for a time. His devotion to duty only lapsed when his flesh failed. Verse 36, even as he was. You notice in the Luke account that we read, it doesn't say that. It just says that he got into the ship. But Mark says, even as he was. Emphasis placed upon his disciples here and their care for the Lord. They sent away the multitude, and they took him even as he was into the ship. And this would indicate his exhaustion, that they possibly even could help him, physically help him get in to the ship. Mark's brief yet pointed words again point to a pathetic scene. The flesh could not sustain the willing spirit of the Lord. In the condition of collapse, they bundled him into the boat. Many followed even in little boats, as we read. They were desperately wanted to be with him. And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship, so that it was now full. No doubt the other boats had turned back because of the storm, and Jesus and his disciples were alone. But Jesus was asleep on a pillow in the back of the boat. The greatness of the wind and the waves filled the little boat with water, and it defied the frantic efforts of his disciples to bail the water out. Even the fishermen among them, who maintained hope while the storm was progressing, now themselves they despaired for their lives. It was worse than anything that they ever experienced on the lake. And he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they wake him and say unto him, Master, carest not that we perish? Who was caring for who in that case? They still had not really come to know the unlimited power of the one that they followed. Their own fear, their lives, did not enable them to restrain their feelings as they awake him and say unto him, no doubt with rebuke, Master, carest not that we perish? What an inappropriate question this was. John's Gospel, chapter 17, we find the answer to that question. John 17, verse 9. I pray for them. I pray not for the world, but for them which thou hast given me, for they are thine. Did Jesus care for them? Certainly did. In John 17, verse 19, he said, and for their sakes I sanctify myself, that they also might be sanctified through the truth. Was he not the Savior of their lives? They understood not his real care for them. Verse 39, he arose, rebuked the wind, and said unto the sea, peace, be still. The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Mark said he arose. Perhaps it is indicating that he had to pull himself out of a very deep sleep. He rebuked the wind. These surely were words which could only come from the Creator. But what of this man? Had he not just yielded to the weakness of the flesh and fallen asleep? Rotherham renders part of this verse as, hush, be still. This is what he said to the elements. Simultaneously, the wind ceased, the tumult of the waves and the roar of torrents, with all their wrath and violence, subsided so quickly that it struck fear in the hearts of those fearful men in that boat. And he said unto them, why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? His words in verse 40 must have shamed them. Shamed them for asking so thoughtlessly, carest thou not? They were so busy worrying about Jesus doing nothing that they overlooked the need for their own faith to be displayed. Anxious fear in terrifying circumstances is a human experience and did not constitute need for rebuke. The care, however, they had expressed from Jesus put them in a responsible position. There was no reason why they should question his interest in their welfare. He always had, and he always would. Put his own life before forsaking them. Although he did not hear the raging of the storm, yet immediately he responded. He responded to their call for help. How is it that you have no faith, he asked. This was a rebuke they could only bear one with another. Can we imagine them looking away and moving to the other side of the boat? Going on with the work of reorganizing the equipment, quietly saying one to another, fearing exceedingly as they did so, "Who then is this, that both wind and sea give ear unto him?" It is not that they did not know who he was. It was their awareness that they did not fully comprehend him. It was a question Mark notes so pointedly, yet now proceeds to answer in the story that follows. Who is this but the one of whom the psalmist spoke when he said, "Which stilleth the roaring of the sea, the roaring of the waves, and the tumult of the people." It's from Psalm 65, verse 7. Does not this psalm illustrate the meaning of this miracle? They took him even as he was. This is another commentary. The Lord had just finished an exhausting preaching session. It might have been timely for him to go with his disciples to the home where they had been staying and have a meal and rest. But without ceremony, they dismissed the multitude and pushed off from the land. Perhaps there is in this, as on some other occasions, an indication that haste was necessary. It might have been because of the plotting of his enemies. It might have been because of overenthusiasm by shallow followers. But all events, they wasted no time. The disciples pulled away. The Lord, evidently worn out, falls asleep. Other boats had accompanied them when they left the shore. They might have been in the determination what's to be shown again, that the Lord should not escape them. Or it might have been to give them a regatta send-off. But whatever it was, the storm which arose seemed to have been the means of their retreat. The other boats were lost. His boat went on. The other boats returning, no doubt, to the shore from where they had come. Such things happen frequently on Galilee. They happen frequently in life as well. Some men are not prepared for them. Others, in some degree, are. One in particular was always ready for the storms. The sea was his father's sea. as much as the land was his Father's house. One was as good a place to sleep as the other, providing that the Son had full confidence in the Father. For the Lord, in literal fact, in the words of the psalmist, Psalm 46, were true. Wherefore will not we fear, though the earth do change, and though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though the waters therefore roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof. Once the disciples became quite used to the Master's power and the Master's care for them, they can no longer think that he careth not that they perish, and no longer seek to startle him into wakefulness. He says to them what he says to the waters: peace, be still. At this stage, it was a literal miracle, wonderful enough indeed, calculated to awaken admiration and reverence in the disciples' minds. But what it meant for themselves, they would not know until they came to understand the meaning of the Lord's "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you." John 14 and 27. There will come a time when the Lord seems far away, when there shall be distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear. Then on the stormy sea of nations, the disciples will know the Lord's peace. Be still. And will look up and lift up their heads, for their redemption draweth nigh. The wind and the sea that we read in chapter 4, verse 41, and the turbulent minds of rebellious people, as well as the disquieted hearts of disciples of little faith, they will be responsive to his voice. For the moment, we're going to leave Mark's account of this incident, this miracle. We'll come back at the end if we have time for any questions or comments. Actually, what I'm going to read you now is from John, and a similar account, a miracle of Jesus walking on the water. This ties in quite well with it. Once embarked upon their journey, they found that the sea arose and the wind blew, indicative of an environment hostile to the well-being of God's servants. The wind blowing represents the insidious, destructive influence of the doctrines of men, in contrast to the commandments of Christ. And they serve as a symbol for one of the greatest dangers confronting God's saints. For such an element as a strong doctrinal wind may well blow the unprepared disciple off course from their intended haven, so that they miss their destination and eventually find that they do not arrive at the kingdom of God. Faith in Yahweh, together with the qualities of courage and determination, will prove to be the only effective counter to the evil winds of false doctrine and philosophy, which blow continually upon the sea of nations. But even then, the believers will not attain to their destination apart from the help that Christ is able to render, not only as an intercessor with the Father, but also in the actual coming to deliver and redeem them. It is evident that the disciples would have been shipwrecked and destroyed apart from Christ's help. And so it is also in the everyday affairs of life. There were two elements involved in the miracle. Two elements were wind and water. We founded a Christadelphian publication entitled Stormy Wind, Fulfilling His Word. The author goes into great details about earthquakes as well, but that's really not part of our subject this morning. I want to consider what he has to say about wind and water. In the introduction, entitled Establishing the Principle, we are all familiar with some aspects of our subject already. We know that in Old Testament times, God sometimes used the natural elements to directly assist his purpose. We are aware of certain prophecies which speak of great earthquakes when Christ returns, and of the possibilities that an increase in earthquakes is a sign of his return. In this book, we will attempt to examine the subject in more depth and open up several less obvious aspects of the subject. For example, two questions which have occurred to the writer are: is there any evidence that God has worked out his purpose with kingdoms and empires as foretold in the Word in climatic changes? And is there any evidence that political upheavals foretold in the Word, often symbolized by earthquakes, are preceded by literal earthquakes and climatic changes as heaven-sent warnings. In the chapters that follow, these questions and others will be answered. First, look at some of the passages that speak of the work of the elements in fulfilling God's purpose. The psalmist, in calling all creation to praise, as Yahweh says, "Praise Yahweh from the earth, ye waterspouts and all deeps, fire and hail, snow and vapor, stormy wind, fulfilling his word." It's found in Psalm 148, verses 7 and 8. In the book of Job, towards the end of the drama, it appears that a great thunderstorm is looming up over the 5 men who were involved: Job, his 3 friends, and Elihu. This caused Elihu to witness to the fact that God uses the natural elements to fulfill his purpose. Reading from Job 36, beginning at verse 26, from the RSV. "Behold, God is great, and we know him not. The number of his years is unsearchable. For he draws up the drops of water. He distills his mist in rain, which the skies pour down, and drop upon man abundantly. Can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds, the thunderings of his pavilion? Behold, he catches his lightning about him, and covers the roots of the sea. And by these he judges peoples. He gives food in abundance. He covers his hands with his lightning, and commands it to strike the mark. And crashing declares concerning him who is jealous with anger against iniquity. Reading from Job 37, beginning at verse 6, again from the RSV. God thunders wondrously with his voice. He does great things which we cannot comprehend. Or to the snow, he says, fall on the earth. And to the showers, and to the rain, be strong. From his chambers comes the whirlwind, and cold from the scattering winds. By the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen fast. He loads the thick clouds with moisture. The clouds scatter his lightning. They turn round and round by his guidance to accomplish all that he commands them. On the face of the habitable world, whether for correction or for his land, for his love, he causes it to happen. And one more little one from Job 38. The Almighty endorsed this when he intervenes in the debate. Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow? Or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war. At the beginning of the book of Nahum, the prophet speaks of God working through both weather and earthquake to fulfill his purpose, especially in the judgment of the wicked. Reading from Nahum 1, verses 3 through 6. Yahweh has his way in the whirlwind and in the storm, in the clouds of the dust of his feet. He rebuketh the sea and maketh dry, and doth dry up all the rivers. Bashan languisheth, and Carmel and the flower of Lebanon languisheth. The mountains quake at him, and the hills melt. And the earth is burned at his presence. Yea, the world and all that dwell therein. Who can stand before his indignation? And who can abide in the fierceness of his anger? So we learn from the passages quoted that God has said that he uses climate and earthquake to fulfill his purpose. With regard to climate or weather, we may perhaps distinguish a short-term and a long-term aspect to the matter. In the short term, God can achieve dramatic things by means of a sudden storm. An example which might have been used to help to destroy an army. He certainly did so in Old Testament times, and we believe that he will do it again in the future. The term aspect is summarized in the phrase already quoted, stormy wind fulfilling his word. This is God using the weather to do his will, since weather, as opposed to climate, in the short term, the climatic conditions are of the moment. In contrast to this is climate, which is a long term and overall is to do and overall is in effect. The climate of a country is a total picture of the weather in experience. So we have, understandably, snows in January, foggy in November, which is written in Great Britain, for example, so this book was obviously written. When we call on the words, when we read in the words already quoted from Job, that they, the clouds, turned round and round at his guidance to accomplish all that he commands them on the face of the habitable world. It means perhaps that God sometimes works out his purpose also by change in the climate for the long term. We're familiar with the term today, climatic change, whether it's, there are various opinions on that anyway. And the author says, we do not propose to plunge immediately into what is generally thought to be prophecy. However, before dealing with predictions, the fulfillment of which came in events outside the narrative portion of the Bible, we propose to look at certain events detailed in the Scriptures to see how God used weather and earthquakes to fulfill His word. Since the Lord God will do nothing, but He reveal it to His servants, the prophets, it's Amos 3, verse 7, we feel that these events are in fulfillment of the previous declared purpose of God. In dealing with these matters, we shall, in a suitable foundation, proceed before dealing with prophecies which were fulfilled in secular history. One of the most well-known dealings with water was found in Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8. The first and greatest intervention of God into human affairs was by means of the element, of course, of the flood. It is absolutely clear from Genesis 6 that God declared it to be His purpose to remove the wickedness of man from the earth by a great flood. Verse 3 may be telling us that the purpose was declared 120 years before it happened. In other words, it was fulfilled of prophecy that the flood came. We are told that when the ark had been built and occupied, in the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. In fact, it is unlikely that this was rain as we know it today, rain that precipitated from the clouds. If all the water in the present atmosphere suddenly precipitated, it would only suffice to cover the ground in an average depth of 2 inches. From whence came the waters of the flood then? The suggestion is the waters which fell as rain from above was that which was placed above the firmament on the second day of creation, Genesis 1, verse 7. This was augmented by waters imprisoned under the earth's crust and released by a mighty earthquake and by volcanic action. If this is true, then it follows that conditions before the flood were very different from those prevailing today. There would be, in fact, have been no rain, and it is shown by the fact that the rainbow was presented as something new after the flood, while the statement of Genesis 2, verses 5 and 6 says as much. The Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground, but there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. The great canopy of water above the firmament would have made temperatures uniformly warm over all the earth, and the present system of atmosphere circulation with winds and storms would not have existed, since it was largely caused by temperature differences. The breaking up the foundation of the great deep, found in Genesis 7, verse 11, seems to indicate that the earth's crust had been stable up to that point, and that the flood was the beginning of that being unstable and the earth's surface, which had been the cause of many earthquakes and volcanoes, has been the cause of many earthquakes and volcanoes since this time, since the earth's crust is no longer stable as it would have been prior to the flood. Our subject, the use which God has made of activities on the earth's crust and in the earth's atmosphere in performing what he has revealed to his servants, the prophets, is therefore shown to have begun with the flood in the 1656th year from Adam to the flood. There is not a hint ever that God ever intervened in these ways to fulfill his will. And this is supported by the evidence that both the earth's atmosphere and the earth's crust were stable at that time. As a consequence of the flood, the earth was changed. The flood came because of the wickedness of man and left behind it an earth with an unstable crust and greatly varying climates, subject to extreme weather conditions, to drought and to flood, to heat and to cold, to which wind, fog, hail, frost, volcanoes, and earthquakes could play their part, though quite angelically manipulated to fulfill God's will. Well, we said we had another subject. Where did you go? Well, that's a little bit about the water. What about the wind? So the wind was involved in our miracle of Jesus calming the sea. The wind we find in the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. They came out of Egypt through the dried up riverbed of the Red Sea. The subsequent destruction of the Egyptian host by the returning waters were equally part of God's purpose, which he declared beforehand to Moses. As we know, he declares to his servants, I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. So what part did weather and earthquake play in this miracle? The means by which the waters were made to stand upright in a heap was the wind. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all the night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. On that Exodus 14, verse 21. Despite this use of the wind, however, we have something here which is not understandable in terms of natural phenomena. For such an effort cannot be the natural way caused by a wind, no matter how strong. The term frozen is perhaps the best way that we can describe how the waters were heaped up. The wind was likewise involved in the return of the waters, for the song of Moses says so. Thou didst blow with the wind, and the sea covered them. We have the wind opening the way for the Israelites, and then closing upon the Egyptians. More than just a strong east wind was involved, however. Passage from Psalm 77 makes it clear that the great storm also occurred, and from its context is referred to the evidence in the Exodus. The clouds poured out water. The skies sent out a sound. Thine arrows also went abroad. The voice of the thunder was in the heavens. The lightnings lightened the world. There may be a reference to this in Exodus 14, where it is said of God that he bound their chariot wheels and made them to drive heavily, which would be a reference to the effects of the thunderstorm by causing the Egyptians' chariots to get clogged in mud. So there's a great deal more. Anyone has a copy of this book? It's called The Stormy Wind Fulfilling His Word. You'll be able to get considerably more than we have time to cover this morning.